Good morning or afternoon to those on the East Coast, and welcome to FSMA Fridays presented with SafetyChain Software and the Atchison Group. And today's topic, quite exciting, lots to talk about. It will be focused on the second review cycles. Part one, we're going to do part one and part two and talk about this in October as well. But today's session will be focused on the preventive controls for human food that did come out. Today, I will be your host, Jill Bender. I'm a VP of Marketing here at SafetyChain Software. And before we get started, just a quick reminder of the few housekeeping rules. Technical issues, we're on WebEx for those that are logged in and might be having some needs for assistance. Number is 877-509-3239 for technical issues with WebEx. Again, 877-509-3239 for technical issues. As always, we will be sending out a recording link probably by Monday at the latest of today's session. If you do have any questions, it's for the online platform only. You can submit those at any time. And as a reminder for your privacy, only the people you can see online are the panelists and your hosts today. However, quite the crowd today, which doesn't surprise us given the news related to FSMA. For today's session, delighted to have David Atchison with us, as well as Jennifer McIntyre. And I say let's just go ahead and get started. David, why don't you share with us certainly the substantial news that's come out regarding the latest updates with FSMA.
Right. I mean, how many months, Jill, have we been doing this and saying, no, really not much to talk about. Obviously, right now we've got tons to talk about. And as you've suggested, we've got revisions to 4 major preventive control rules. And just to recap what those are, the preventive control rule for human food, for animal foods, produce, and the foreign supply verification program. Those are the 4 sets of reproposals, as they're being called, that have come out from FDA at the end of last week. So lots of digestion going on right now with these rules, and happy to dive right into one of them, which we're going to talk about this week, and then we'll focus on some of the others next month. So that's the update. I think probably everybody on the call already knows that.
Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and dive in. We had a couple pre-submitted questions that did come in. We'll go through those first, and then, of course, we'll open it up for I'm sure, a fruitful dialogue about everything going on. Question I have up here, and let's go ahead and lob this over to you, Jennifer. Why do you think the FDA removed the term reasonably likely to occur for hazards?
Sure, Jill. Thanks a lot. You know, as we've been talking about preventive controls, we've been impressing upon people this term that these are hazards that are reasonably likely to occur. Those are the hazards for which you need to develop preventive controls. And now in the reproposals, FDA has said in response to comments that some people found this term to be confusing because it was a term that historically has been associated with FDA's HACCP regulations. And preventive controls is more than just HACCP. So in order for people to realize that these hazards that need to be controlled, which FDA is now proposing to call significant hazards, that they may require preventive controls above or beyond or different from critical control points, FDA didn't want to be bound to the term hazards reasonably likely to occur, where people's minds might immediately go to, oh, it's a hazard reasonably likely to occur, it needs a critical control point. Because, again, preventive controls may include controls other than those that we typically see or have historically seen as part of the HACCP plan. So in terms of what's the likely impact, you know, will that list of hazards on what I'll call the short list be any different, whether you call them hazards that are reasonably likely to occur or hazards that are now significant hazards? I'm not sure that the hazards themselves are going to be any different or that the risk of them is going to be judged to be any different. It's a little more of a semantics issue, but to get people thinking that we are looking at preventive controls, not just CCPs.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, this is David. If I could just add to that, Jill, just very briefly, I think Jennifer's hit it exactly right. And it was interesting reading the comments, or some of the comments linked to this, is obviously many felt that the FDA was asking for critical control points up and down, and as Jennifer said, that's not what it was about. I don't think that was what it was ever about. I think it was clear that if you have a HACCP plan, and maybe this is just an important practical point, if you have a HACCP plan already, you're not going to waste any of that. It is all just going to get folded into the food safety plan, and as Jennifer has said, the agency is expecting us to be thinking outside of the traditional HACCP critical control point box and to be looking for these other risks, which they just termed significant hazards. But effectively, the nomenclature has changed, but the thought process has not. And I think Jennifer's exactly right. You'll come up with the same list.
Okay. I mean, it does sound like a significant, distinctions that they're trying to make here. Absolutely. Well, let's go ahead and move to the next question. And David, I'll ask you to take this on. What is the further definition of situations where environmental testing will be required?
Yeah, this is one of, I think, three very predictable components of these reproposals that came out. And anybody who's been tracking with TAG over the last couple of years will know that we've been saying for a long time, expect environmental monitoring to come into back into the regulatory requirements, and that's exactly what's happened. I think in some of the earlier thinking about this pre-original proposed rule, it was, well, we should have environmental monitoring everywhere, and clearly that's just not either practical, economically feasible, or public health focused. So that appropriately got ditched. What FDA has done now is basically to say, yeah, we expect you to look at your environment, and particularly focused on ready-to-eat areas in the environment, and are going to require us all to conduct environmental monitoring in those specific areas. Now, they're not being entirely prescriptive, so they talk about a requirement that the facility conduct environmental monitoring as appropriate to the facility, the food, and the nature of the preventive control. They make specific point that it would be required in specific circumstances where ready-to-eat products exposed. I mean, and this focus is, again, it's a no-brainer, really. It's in that environment prior to packaging, after food comes out of its processing, heat, whatever it may be, before it's packaged, would need that environmental monitoring to be done. Now, the agency appropriately recognized that you may yet have a control down the road with your products, and this is about pathogens. Obviously, it's about Listeria, it's about Salmonella first and foremost, and they make an exception saying, well, we expect you to set up environmental monitoring in that ready-to-eat area prior to packaging, unless that food is going to receive a treatment that's going to effectively take care of the pathogen down the road once it's in the package. So they focused it in specific areas, I think appropriately. And again, from our perspective, I think many companies are already recognizing that environmental monitoring in that space is very appropriate. So that this is the requirement. It is focused in ready to eat. It's focused in ready to eat where you're not going to have a further kill step. Predictably, we are going to have to maintain records. So we're going to need a written procedure for our environmental monitoring. We're going to have the records of the monitoring, and we're going to have corrective action procedures. And again, I think the FDA is going to be expecting us to build a robust program and to have appropriate corrective actions. Just interestingly, and this is something that just strikes an interesting chord, that in this reproposal, the FDA has actually popped out some numbers in terms of the anticipated number of facilities that are going to be impacted by some of these changes. And from a personal perspective, I looked at these and thinking, whoa, those numbers just seem to be low to me. And in this particular context, they've said that the expectation is that about 1,800 human food facilities will have to set up these controls. My sense is it's probably more than that, but I haven't actually tracked the logic of where they came up with the 1800. One other point on this one, it will also apply to animal production, animal food production as well. So that's the logic behind it. That's what the expectation is, and this clearly is another significant add to the to-do list under what FDA is expecting.
Great. Jennifer, did you have anything to add to this?
No, I think that David covered it quite well.
Right, and 1,800 does seem a bit of a lofty number, doesn't it? So I would be shocked if that was really the true impact. Moving on to the next question, Jennifer, I will ask you to take this on. What is the role of the finished product testing in verification of food safety plans?
Sure. This is an area, the question of whether or not FDA would require finished product testing was one that I was a little less certain about before the reproposal was put out, because finished product testing is, in many instances, like looking for a needle in a haystack at best. And so I knew that a lot of companies were very concerned that FDA would require finished product testing. And the way that the agency handled this in the reproposal is by proposing that finished product testing be conducted as appropriate. So on the one hand, there's flexibility. On the other hand, that's an awful lot of subjectivity to determine whether or not you think that it's appropriate in your facility for your products to conduct finished product testing. So it is in there. It is listed as a verification activity to determine if your overall food safety system is working well. It appears to me, as you're trying to make that decision, is it appropriate and do I need to do finished product testing as a verification step, that the things you'd be looking at are the types of preventive controls that you have in place. So to me, if you're relying on those controls other than CCPs, other than the validated process controls, if you're looking at sanitation perhaps, or you're looking at employee hygiene like hand washing, controls that FDA is not requiring to be validated, but that you need to make sure are actually happening appropriately, maybe one way to verify those is to look at finished product testing. David had mentioned that on the environmental side, the FDA's cost estimate is based on, 1,300, 1,800 facilities doing environmental testing. When we look at what FDA anticipates in terms of the number of facilities who will do finished product testing, it's around 300. To me, that's extraordinarily small. So I think some people have interpreted that, if appropriate, to mean that they must do it. But when you look at the dollars and cents of it, at least based on FDA's economic impact, they're not expecting that everybody's going to do it. Really a minority of facilities that would do finished product testing. If you do determine that it's appropriate for you, the same type of record keeping would apply that David described. Having the written procedures, having those corrective actions, all the documentation would be required if you choose to use finished product testing as a part of your verification. And I don't know, David, if you see things differently around what FDA really is looking for here.
No, I don't, Jennifer. I think you're right. When I first was reading some of the summaries of the reproposal under this one, and I saw finished product testing had made its way in there, I mean, I immediately had a sinking feeling, and I thought, oh gosh, where's this headed? And I'm sure many in the food industry had the same perspective as I did, because I have never been a strong advocate of using this as a significant public health measure. Again, that's just a personal Atchison comment. Some do use it and believe it works. And it was actually, as you dive into the weeds on this one, I totally agree that this is a sort of, it's there if you want it. And I think your point, Jennifer, of it only impacting 300 some facilities really sends the message that this FDA do not expect companies to do this very often. If we look at the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of facilities that fall under this part of the rule because they are registered with FDA, it's a tiny, 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 tiny fraction. I think that's this is sort of the agency, I think, politically had to do it. I think they had to get pushed into doing this. That's just, again, my personal view. And they've actually done it in a way that gives most people an out if they so choose. But as you said, I think if you do this, if you do finished product testing as part of a verification that the preventive control is working, you're going to have to keep a boatload of records around it. It's not just a matter of doing it and saying that, okay, we've got that box checked. So this was not nearly as bad as it could have been. I think that's probably where I'm landing.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's go ahead and move to the next question. It's actually the last question we have for pre-submitted questions, and we'll open up the floor here shortly for all the questions that I'm sure will be coming in. And David, why don't you go ahead and take this one. What are the requirements and responsibilities for controlling suppliers along company supply chain?
Yeah, you know, this is another one that was predictable, and it was predictable for a couple of reasons. It was predictable because, first and foremost, everybody, I think, in the food industry recognizes that controlling supply chain risk is a very important part of controlling brand risk. It's where leading companies are trying to go, and it's a huge challenge. So it makes logical sense, and we know from experience that suppliers have and will probably continue to send us ingredients and food that is not suitable, and it causes problems and it causes recalls. So there's precedent here. The second reason why this is logical is based on what was in the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which we've talked about in the past, and we'll certainly talk about that next month in more depth. But the Foreign Supplier Verification Program is essentially a supply chain risk control requirement for imported FDA-regulated foods. It really boils down to, again, looking at the Foreign Supplier Program, it boils down to who are you getting food from, is there a hazard in it, and how is that hazard being controlled? And it was evident when Foreign Supplier Program came out that we had set a different bar for imported foods than foods sourced domestically. And it was pretty evident that wasn't going to fly from a trade perspective, and that's likely part of the driver here, as well as the somewhat logic of controlling supply chain risk from a public health perspective. So what this addition to the preventive control rule has done is essentially to align this rule with the Foreign Supply Verification Program. So the two approaches are really now very, very similar. And the Foreign Supply Verification Program reproposal, which we'll talk about next week, has been tweaked somewhat. I think the two are aligned, which basically means it doesn't matter whether you source domestically or you source from outside of the United States, you will need to have a supplier program. So what does that mean? As with all of FSMA, FDA has made this a risk-based requirement. They focused on essentially the same principles that we've talked about many times in relation to your food safety plan and what Jennifer was talking about earlier with the significant hazard. And it's a matter of looking at your ingredients and materials that you are getting from an outside source and determining, do they contain a significant risk? And if they do, who is controlling that risk? And they pop out a couple options. And one of the options is you can be controlling it yourself, and another is you have to make sure that the supplier is controlling it. And my interpretation of that is that if we take something that that may have an inherent risk to it, may have a significant hazard, some sort of an herb of some sort that's perhaps got a track record, or a spice of some sort that's got a track record of having had salmonella. So our hazard analysis would determine that, yes, this this particular ingredient that we're sourcing from different places has a significant hazard. What I'm doing with that herb is I'm putting it in a blend, and then I'm going to cook it to create a cooked product. I'm doing that. I'm controlling that risk. I need to document that I've controlled that risk. So in that situation, I've identified that salmonella in that ingredient is a risk. It's a significant risk, but I don't need to verify that the supplier is controlling that risk because I'm controlling the risk, and I document that I've done that. Now flip that around, and you're using exactly the same ingredient, say, on a finished product. After it's gone through your processing step, you're adding it as a garnish or something right at the end just before it goes in the packaging, in which case risk is the same, ingredient is the same, but the control would then fall back on the supplier, and you as the user of that would need to ensure that that supplier is controlling the risk. As with some of the with the foreign supply verification program in the first version, the agency is giving us some options around that. We can do audits, we can do testing, we can review the supplier's programs. There's a number of things that we can do there to mitigate and control that risk in the supplier. There is, however, one little tweak to this. If your analysis says that, yes, we've got a significant risk, and that risk poses a reasonable probability of a serious adverse health event or death, so it's essentially a reasonable probability of a Class 1 type situation. So we're really boiling this down to a Class 1 definition. If that ingredient poses that level of risk, and you are not controlling it, you, the user of the ingredient, are not controlling it, then you will have to do an annual audit of that facility, of that supplier. Or let me be specific, an annual audit will have to be conducted. It doesn't say that you as the recipient of the ingredient has to do that audit, but there has to be an annual audit. But the agency's given us a little wiggle room, and they've said the default is that you can do an annual audit. Or there has to be, I should say, an annual audit for an ingredient that we've determined has a significant hazard that could cause a Class 1 type situation. The agency has said default is get an annual audit done, or you can essentially develop the documentation to present to FDA, should you be asked for it, to show that some less frequent on-site auditing or some other assurance is adequate. So it would be a case-by-case exception, but the default would be an annual on-site audit for by somebody. And without sort of stealing all the thunder from Foreign Supply Verification Program, as I said, these are falling in alignment, the two of them. So essentially, the process is very similar between the two. I think one other point to mention on this is where does GFSI fit into this? And my view is that GFSI will align with this. As many of you know, we at TAG have done a bunch of work with some of the GFSI schemes, and they're already extremely well aligned, the ones that we've looked at, with the preventive control rules. So I think we're basically getting to the point here where if you have a GFSI audit of that supplier, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape, and that will take care of it. But and once again, this is another thing that's been added to our list of to-dos, and there's going to be a need for a written supplier program. There's going to be a need for maintaining records around all of this, of following up on it all. So it has upped the burden, no question, of what companies who are subject to this preventive control rule for human foods, companies that are going to have to do this. It's added another chunk of to-do to our already fairly voluminous to-do list with regard to these rules. So I think that's a little bit of a long-winded answer, Jill, but there was lots of sort of moving parts in this supplier one.
No, absolutely. And as you mentioned, next month we will certainly be diving a bit more into the foreign supply component. On that, and just sort of a follow-up question, as far as the alignment you were alluding to, I mean, would that be sort of a direct correlation to the comments received during the from the last cycle?
You mean alignment with between the two types of rules?
Right. When you
Yes.
mentioned this, just a quick comment that came in, which appears. So when they had the comment period before they put out the second cycle, I know there was a lot of certainly comments or outcry about it that they weren't aligned. So it seems like a direct.
I suspect so. Yes, I haven't.
Yeah.
I have not read all the comments by any means, but you know, I think it was kind of obvious that we'd ended up with a non-tariff trade barrier here, and it was predictable that domestic would go the same route. So, I mean, just to go full circle on that, essentially what this has ended up being is that you will need a supplier risk management program, whether you are sourcing domestically or you're sourcing what's deemed as an imported product. And I think the same program, the same approach will work for both, but it doesn't differentiate anymore. So it removes that trade barrier of, well, if I'm sourcing this ingredient from Mexico or I'm sourcing it from a neighboring state, that basically the burden was different between the two in terms of the hoops I had to go through. Now, they've leveled that playing field. And that was probably driven by comment, and it was actually just sort of almost just an inevitable foregone conclusion that they either had to put this in the preventive control rules for domestic or take it all out of foreign supplier verification program, which wasn't going to happen because it would have gutted that program.
Right. Okay, great. Then let's go ahead and just move forward. And I think that was our last pre-submitted question. I am going to open up the floor right now for questions from the audience. And some have already started to come in and have gotten quite a few comments as well. So let me take us out of full screen for those that are online with us in WebEx. You can go ahead and submit your questions in the Q&A tab. And then also, as we quickly approach the bottom of the hour here, I am just going to do a quick review as we wrap up FSMA Friday sessions each time. Let you know, again, the recording will be made available probably end of day today or Monday morning the latest. One thing I did sort of want to mention, and David, you had talked about this from a GFSI alignment. We do have our GFSI webcast leadership series going on. Each of the larger schemes, SQF, SSSC, 20,000 BRC, have been discussing the road ahead, and a key component of that, how they're aligning with FSMA. And our next session is literally here at the top of the hour with SSA 22,000. And again, as topics for next month, we'll definitely be delving a bit more into all the different review cycles that came out. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and put a few questions out there, and I will have, let me just take a look at certainly one of the first ones, and either Dave or Jennifer jump on in. First question I have is, are there any differences in the implementation of elements of preventive controls for ready-to-eat foods and further processed foods?
Let me start that one, Jill. The answer is yes. The basic approach for all foods is, where are your risks? Are they significant? And if they are, you have to control them with your food safety plan and all the components that go with it. But as I was saying during my discussion of the environmental monitoring, there is a very clear difference there with the environmental monitoring program that is now going to be a requirement for, or assuming these rules go final, will be a requirement in the ready-to-eat part of your operation, unless they are further processed. If they are further processed, then you don't have to do it. But I think that's a brief answer to that question.
Okay, great. Moving on to the next question in regards to, let's see, when using a co-manufacturer for your branded product, who is responsible for the supplier verification under FSMA?
If I can start that one, Jill, and I'd be interested in David's commentary. You know, this is a tricky question, I think. You know, whose supplier is it? Is it the co-manufacturer supplier, or is it the brand supplier? If you look at how the preventive control rule is structured and who it applies to registered facilities. And so it's the registered facility that needs to have a food safety plan, that needs to evaluate the risks of the product that they're producing in their facility, regardless of whose brand it's under, regardless of whether they're a co-manufacturer or not, and I think even regardless of who on paper owns that product or that ingredient, that raw material. And so my read is that technically the responsibility would be on that co-manufacturer, because it's the product, the ingredient that's coming into their facility that they're going to be controlling the hazards from a process control standpoint, from a sanitation standpoint. Why wouldn't they be the ones responsible for doing supplier verification if it applies to that raw material? Now, I imagine that this will be the subject of a lot of discussion and negotiation between the co-manufacturer and the brand, especially if the brand is the one who dictates who the supplier of that raw material will be, and if the co-manufacturer doesn't have a choice as to the supplier that they use. So I think this could be a contentious issue between the parties involved. But my read is that from FDA's standpoint, from the preventive controls rule, that it's on a facility basis. So you're bringing it into your facility, you're the one that needs to evaluate the supplier and manage those risks. But David, do you see it any differently?
No, Jennifer, I don't. But what this question does is actually trigger a broader point, which I didn't mention when I was talking about supplier. There's quite a bit of language in this in the reproposal around this issue, which is a couple comments just to illustrate where I'm going, which is, what about my supplier's supplier? And one of the points that the FDA makes here is, what if a distribution center is the immediate previous source of the raw material that you've determined is a problem? And the FDA is proposing that the DC would not be required to establish a supplier program. It wouldn't be considered the supplier. Rather, the supplier would be the manufacturer or the farm where the manufactured processed food came from originally. So in that scenario, we can envisage a situation where we're going to have to start digging into going down a layer. There's another scenario that the FDA point out in the reproposal. Scenario in which a facility receives an ingredient from a supplier, but the control of the hazard in that ingredient is by the supplier's supplier. So how does that work? And the FDA is suggesting that the way that would work is that the receiving facility would determine, yes, there's a significant hazard in this ingredient. They would conduct supplier verification activities that would include verification that the supplier has conducted an appropriate verification that its supplier has controlled the hazard. Now, this gets complicated. So where I'm going with this is, if I've received an ingredient from Jennifer, and I see it as a hazard, and Jennifer has received it from Jill, our host on this call, what I would have to do would be to ensure that Jennifer's supplier program is robust enough to control the risk of that ingredient from Jill. That is what they are proposing, and that's different from the hopping over the distribution center argument. So I think this sort of builds off what Jennifer was saying, and there's lots of, well, what ifs, and what if this, and what if that, and if you get into the weeds of this reproposal, there's all sorts of interesting little nuances in here about what we're going to have to do.
Okay, great. And again, I suspect that we're just going to have more questions than answers on that one, certainly, as you keep diving into it. Moving on to a couple other questions that have come in on related topics. Since warehouses are required to be FDA registered also, so they would also be required to be fully compliant to FSMA, is the comment.
Yeah, Jill, I'll take that, and it kind of relates a little bit to David's comment about the distribution center and what they would be doing. So, yes, warehouses are registered facilities, and as such, the preventive controls rule would apply to them. But FDA has recognized that depending on the type of product that warehouse handles, it may not really make sense for them to have to fully comply. And so there is an exemption if a warehouse is handling a shelf-stable product that is fully packaged, not exposed to the environment, so kind of finished products, shelf-stable products, then they do not, although they're registered facilities, they would be exempt from the preventive controls rule. If they are handling, again, the fully packaged product, not exposed to the environment, but it requires temperature control for safety, then their only requirement would be to make sure that there was temperature control. So in both of those instances, they would not need to do the full hazard analysis and implement essentially preventive controls, except for that temperature one. They would not need to verify their suppliers. If they are handling other types of products that maybe are exposed to the environment, or if they're doing any sort of manufacturing, anything that would be considered processing in their facilities, then they would need to be fully implementing the proposed rule, doing the hazard analysis and identifying preventive controls. So yes, they're registered, but the extent to which, whether or not they need to comply with preventive controls, and if so, to what extent, really depends on exactly what's happening in that facility and what types of products are there, more so than just calling it a warehouse.
Right. And I think there was one more question that was sort of follow-up, and it sounds like it's presumably sort of the same answer. I don't know if Jennifer, if you saw it come in, but it talks in reference to the brand holder distributor, if you're responsible under FSVP to ensure that the co-packer is meeting FSMA requirements. And as you said, I mean, it sounds like it's much more specific to what it is, correct?
Well, in foreign supplier verification program, which I think we'll talk in more detail about on the next call next month, is specific to those who are importing. So although there's general alignment between the requirements for an imported product versus one that is domestically sourced, there are actually, in my opinion, some slight differences in that as a manufacturing facility, if you need to do supplier verification, if appropriate, for raw materials. If you're an importer, it doesn't matter if it's a raw material or a finished product. You need to have that foreign supplier verification. Whether or not you're the brand holder or the distributor, your obligation under foreign supplier verification program is dependent on whether you are considered the importer.
Okay. David, anything to add to that?
No, I don't. I think that was
great.
Jennifer had a perfect answer on that.
Okay, great. And we do need to wrap this up. I am going to just throw one more question out there. And as people are exiting, just a reminder, there's a survey that pops up for those online. And we do read those. And if you have specific questions for the next session or input you'd like to provide, or if you need some help with your documentation or assessing if SafetyChain could help you with your FSMA-ready food safety plans, there's an option to ask for more information on that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this session with just the last question. It's just regards to the comments capability and what's going to happen this second cycle. There's certainly been put out there that this is the final reviews. Care to comment on that?
Yep, that's it. This is it. This is our last. Well, let me be a bit more succinct and clear in what I'm trying to say here. Is the FDA has made it very clear that they do not. They haven't opened the comment period for anything else that is not specifically called out in the reproposal. So if there were things in the original proposed rule that you didn't like that have not been adjusted, changed in the reproposal, then just too bad. That comment period has closed. So there's a 75-day comment period for all 4 rules, which is open. And I haven't done the math in my head. I'm sure Jennifer has, but I think that pops us out close to Christmas or thereabouts to respond to the reproposals with comments. So that closes the door on this by pretty much the end of 2014, which then gives the agency close to 8 months, almost 9 months to finalize these rules. Big questions were floating around beginning of last week. will all of this stuff get kicked down the road like we saw the first time with elections? And my sense it won't, and it hasn't. So these came out a little bit later than anticipated, but they're out, and they're out in full force. So there is absolutely no reason to think, even though you may wish it, that the deadlines for the final rules will slide. I really don't think they will. I think we should be working towards that as a goal in terms of getting ready for anticipation of the final rules. Two final comments on that, Jill. Firstly is I think we're getting more and more granular information on what these final rules were going to look like, so there's absolutely no excuse to wait. There's a lot of this that is not going to change. And as I alluded to in a couple of earlier answers, the FDA has added quite a bit to our to-do list here. And although they've added a little flexibility and they've certainly added clarity in a few places, they have effectively said, you've got to figure out if you need environmental monitoring and how you're going to do it and build a system to do it. And you've got to assess your supplier risks and build a program to control that in terms of significant hazards and risk-based. Those are two got-to-dos. I think, as we discussed, the finished product testing is a little bit more of you can do it if you want, but if you do it, make sure you do it right kind of approach. But as I'm repeating myself, the to-do list has grown, mm-hmm. So all the more reason not to hang around. We need to get moving.
And I think just sort of a follow-up, and as we wrap up today's session, we do have slated for November's topic, basically what you're just talking about, but I'm assuming we'll be delving into more details about simply what's not going to be going away in the final reviews, final rules, excuse me, and more importantly, how to start preparing for that. So we'll see if a half hour is enough for that discussion in November, but again, that's what we're slated to talk about in November. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's discussion. As suspected, quite a few questions. If we did not get to yours, we will do our best to bring them up for the next session. And David and Jennifer, thank you as always. I knew that we would have a lot of response and interest in this topic, and do appreciate that you all ramped up as quickly as you could in just the short week that the substantial changes have been out. And we'll look forward to a further discussion next month.
Great. Thanks, Jill.
Okay.
Sounds great. Appreciate everybody's questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.